Hi, friends. I thought we might all need some soothing music this morning. I hope you're all doing well. Welcome. It's ECM. You know that already. This is Resistance Live, and I'm sliding over, so I'm like centered on my camera. How y'all doing today? Sorry for the recentering while we're live. I'm Elizabeth Cronise McLaughlin. As always, I'm coming to you from occupied Tongva land here in Southern California. And today, for our visually challenged viewers, I'm wearing a oatmeal-colored, big, fluffy turtleneck sweater. And my hair is pulled back, and I have my thick gold hoops in, and I have on pink lipstick. I'm a pink-skinned, green-eyed, dirty, blonde-haired woman. I have my big plant behind me, and my chair, and my floor lamp, and my big bookshelf. I'm in my office, as always. Happy Halloween, everyone. My pronouns, as always, are she, her. And don't forget to like the broadcast. Okay, so today I was sitting here thinking about kind of what I wanted to talk about and the questions that had come through on the Patreon feed. Speaking of which, let me get rid of that banner really quick. And one of the things that kept coming up as kind of like an overarching theme were these issues of corruption inside the GOP and how we're seeing them play out kind of nonstop right now. So there have been a couple of really big developments over the last 24 hours by the House GOP and also in relation to some very big conservative GOP donors. And, I want everybody to kind of just be aware that there is, there's just ongoing implications, first of all, of just how absolutely corrupt all of this is. But second of all, that the Senate is actually taking action. And I think that we've kind of got to, once again, be focused on the positive developments there, while also being very mindful of the way in which the GOP is doing its thing, right? Nobody should be surprised. And we've talked a lot about everything that Mike Johnson stands for, and the fact that he ended up being the dark horse for the speakership tells us a lot about where they sit at the moment. So let's cover just first and foremost the primary issue that's come in the last 24 hours, which is that the House GOP has essentially decided to hold hostage any funding for Israel, or for that matter, for Ukraine, in exchange for eliminating from one of the major bills that was passed by the Biden administration last year. They're going to eliminate all of the funding that went into that to the IRS to collect from tax cheats. And this is particularly related to those folks who make more than $1 million a year and are way behind on their taxes. And one of the things that we've seen since this was included in that legislation is that the IRS has been able to recover like hundreds of millions of dollars from the uber wealthy who have been failing to adequately pay their taxes. So this is in essence a trade-off by the House GOP for another tax break for the rich in exchange for funding for various efforts around the world that are obviously very front and center right now. So one of the things that I think is really critical here is that we understand that in addition to being fascist, they're also profoundly corrupt, and those two things are sort of inherently linked. Again, if you have not read Jason Stanley's book, How Fascism Works, one of the things that you need to understand is that one of the defining features of fascism, in addition to kind of like sexual panic, a la what's happening with trans kids, more on that in a second, is corruption top to bottom. It's in essence that they allow the folks who are in power to benefit financially from the power that they hold. And so one of the things on this is that we just need to be mindful of is that we're going to see more and more of this from the House until we vote these people out. And again, I got to remind everybody, no law gets passed in this country by the House alone, right? So the thing that's really key here, however, is what the negotiation is going to look like to get this funding finished. And again, the House holds the purse strings. We do have, we're literally 18 days now from when the federal government may shut down again. Again, I'm not sure this is going to pass, to be honest, but I have very serious concerns at this point about the fact that the House does have some unique authority over the power of the purse. And, this is one of the reasons why the government shutdown nearly happened, because the House couldn't get its stuff together I have to try not to swear on YouTube or I get like dinged. So one of the things that that everybody should just be aware of is that we're going to see how this plays out. However, there's another development out of the Senate Judiciary Committee, again, the Senate, under the control of the Democrats, that folks should be aware of, which is that the Senate Judiciary announced yesterday that they're going to subpoena Harlan Crow, Leonard Leo, and one other significant high-level GOP donor about their levels of influence over Clarence Thomas and other members of the Supreme Court. This is a very big deal already because the district attorney in the District of Columbia is already investigating Leonard Leo, and he is refusing to comply with the investigation, like refusing to respond to subpoenas and the like. So again, this is an effort right now to find out, one of the things that the Senate Judiciary Committee wants to know is how much money, for instance, has gone to Ginny Thomas over the years, and how much money has gone into the pockets of Clarence Thomas in the form of in-kind exchange for things like quote unquote hospitality, right? All of that is very significant, and we'll have to see whether or not they comply. I'm going to remind everybody, Steve Bannon has been found guilty already, as has Peter Navarro, of not complying with congressional subpoenas. Whether or not those folks are going to end up doing time, given that those are on appeal, is anybody's guess at this point. But this is a situation where the heat is being ramped up on the GOP's corruption. And again, we're going to have to see how this plays out. Third big thing that is underway right now that folks should be aware of is that the effort to expel George Santos from Congress is reaching a true fever pitch. And the interesting thing about this one is that it is initiated by House Republicans in New York. Now, I have to remind everybody, 2/3 vote of the House to expel George Santos. However, it looks like they might have the votes. And this is really interesting, honestly. I have to say that I think one of the things that is likely going on here is that there is such a serious concern about the blowback from George Santos. And again, with this new set of indictments for which he was arraigned last Friday, which indicate that he engaged in credit card fraud and identity theft for some individual small donors. I mean, we already know he's way beyond the pale. But again, these are things that ordinarily would land you in prison for like 5 or 10 years at a time. And I think there's a serious concern amongst the House Republicans in New York, given that he is one, that the blowback on them in 2024 is likely to be extreme if Santos isn't removed. So, we're going to have to see how this goes. I mean, it's not going to take that many Republicans because we know all the Democrats will vote to expel him. And then the next step here is to see what happens next. Now, I have to remind everybody, if he is removed, someone will be appointed temporarily by Governor Kathy Hochul of New York, who is a Democrat. All right. So it may very well shift things a bit inside the House, like by one seat, but not enough to really make that much of a difference because it's not going to shift the majority. Christina, I'm not convinced that that's the case. I think they're actually, so Christina's saying she'd be shocked if they expel him, that they just want to show that they tried. That's actually not what the reporting is demonstrating. The reporting is demonstrating is that they're waiting for a vote until they have the 2/3 they need to expel him. So it's interesting. And again, I have to point out, a lot of these House Republicans in New York are in districts that Biden won in 2020. And so again, their job security is on the line here, and it's serious, right? We talked about this a lot in the run up to the speaker's votes, the multitude of them, all 8,734 of them. And personally, I think that it's quite a concern here in terms of their own reelectability. So I'm, I may be wrong, but my gut sense about this is that they're waiting on the vote until we see what happens. Yes, they still voted for Johnson as speaker, Linda. You're right. I mean, again, I have to say, there are no moderates inside the GOP, but there are a lot of self-interested and corrupt politicians. That's the theme of today, right? So they may very well want to expel him to be able to say that they did the right thing so that then they can get reelected, even if it's not really about doing the right thing, right? There's layers here of rationale. So again, they want to stay in power. And I have to remind everybody that when it comes to the GOP, that is the ultimate aim above anything else, is they want to stay in power. They want to stay in power, and they want to stay in power so that they can continue to benefit from it financially, and so that they can continue to, benefit the uber wealthy, and so that white supremacy in America doesn't die, right? That's what they're after. So again, we'll have to see how that goes, but there is movement on these fronts this morning, and I just want to kind of reiterate that, right? Like, I know it's a very hard moment. I'm going to get to some more of that in a second, but I just really want people to like be reminded that there is some good happening in certain windows right now, and we've got to stay focused on that as well. Okay. A new indictment dropped yesterday in Fulton County against an Alabama man who threatened Fani Willis and the sheriff of Fulton County with death threats after one of Trump's latest tirades on Truth Social. I don't have very much to say about this beyond the fact that, as this audience already knows, and I want everybody to kind of like, remember, nothing about the gag orders that Trump is currently subject to have to do with his First Amendment right to free speech. That needle has been threaded very effectively by both Judge Engoron and by Judge Chutkan. What it's designed to do is prevent exactly this, like exactly this. And I am personally really glad to see these indictments drop, because the other thing about this set of indictments is that it confirms and is further evidence for the decision of Judge Chutkan that dropped on Sunday night, and the actions of Judge Engoron in trying to rein in Trump's statements in New York State about his law clerk and others. So again, we need way more enforcement here. Like, again, I have to say, I'm going to keep saying to all of you, it has to be done right, or it's going to threaten to overturn any conviction that he eventually suffers. But the more evidence they have of this, the easier it is to make the case on appeal and elsewhere, right? It's got to be in the record. But, like if, for instance, Judge Chutkan decides to throw him in jail the next time that he violates her gag order, things like this are going to be the evidence as to why. And so, again, it's very good. It's good movement in the direction of like accountability. Okay. Somebody asked a question about Mark Meadows' limited use immunity, because apparently Andy McCabe made a statement that he thought Meadows' limited use immunity made it less likely for him to be indicted in federal court. I respect Andy. He's an FBI agent and I'm a lawyer. And while he knows his stuff, I have to say that I think that is not a totally accurate take, or at least I disagree with it. Let's put it that way. Great minds can differ, as we know very well here. The fact that he has limited use immunity for testimony before a grand jury means that it is limited to a very narrow window, right? It just simply means that the testimony that he gave in front of the grand jury and to Jack Smith's team cannot be used against him in a subsequent prosecution. Just that testimony. Okay. It doesn't give him like blanket immunity. It doesn't mean that he's flipped. It literally just means that the conversation that you had here cannot be entered into the record in a future prosecution. And yes, his cooperation might be something that is subsequently used in a sentencing hearing to give him a lesser sentence or as a deviation from the sentencing guidelines, assuming he's convicted. But do I think that this means that he's like off the hook in the federal investigation? No, I don't. And I happen to think as well that, we have yet to see the depths of Jack Smith's complete investigation here. We know it's ongoing. We know that he tailored Trump's indictments in DC to make sure that the case could be tried in advance of the November 2024 election. So again, people can differ on these issues. And all of us are tea leaf reading to a certain extent, because nobody knows at this point the depths of the investigation that Jack Smith is still undertaking. All right. But I will tell you that, in my opinion, a limited use immunity for a very narrow, tiny bit of testimony is not likely to be something that would prevent a future indictment. And I'm actually not alone in that opinion. There's been other lawyers who have said the same, including significant legal commentators. Roberta, Judge Chutkan did say that she might move up the trial dates if there are future violations. She also said, and you can go back and listen to yesterday's broadcast if you missed it, that she was going to be taking each potential violation on its own merit and considering the context of each individual violation going forward. I also talked about the statements of Bill Barr in yesterday's broadcast when we were talking about Chutkan's new order, so you can go check that out as well. I don't have any idea, Helene, when Jack Smith is going to wrap up. I have to remind everybody that the Watergate prosecutions took a decade. So I don't have a ballpark on that at all. And, we saw that Fani Willis, because she wanted to do it right in Georgia, took 2 years to reach indictments from when that investigation began. 2.5, actually, almost. So again, we have to see how this all plays out. But I also want to remind everyone that any future sanctions against Trump, while the judge can certainly raise them herself, they are more likely to come from a motion from Jack Smith's team to invoke a violation of the order and appropriate sanctions. So we haven't seen that yet on the comments that he made about Bill Barr. They were made 90 minutes after her new order dropped and the stay was reinstated. I happen to think that looks like a violation, but again, Jack Smith's team has got to make a judgment call here about what they're going to do in relation to it, and we'll see. We'll see. Okay. Somebody asked a question about whether or not Sidney Powell's deal was likely to be revoked. And I did touch on this a little bit last week. Again, I have to point out here that it very much depends on what Fani Willis's team wants to do here. If she doesn't testify truthfully against any of the other defendants or one of the other defendants, yes, her deal is going to be revoked. Is the fact that she's out there reposting things about pressure from prosecutors likely to get her deal revoked? No. And I have to remind everyone that, just because she's cut a deal doesn't mean that she loses her ability to comment on arbitrarily, randomly, perhaps attached issues. She's not allowed to comment on the witnesses. She's not allowed to comment on the investigation. But is she allowed to make generalized comments or repost generalized comments about what she perceives to be pressure that's being levied by the judicial system? Yes. And, I think that's a stretch to claim that that's a violation of the plea deal. The idea that she's out there reposting issues around whether or not the election was, stolen from Trump. Again, I'm sure Fani Willis's team is considering that. But do I think that at the moment her deal is in jeopardy? No, I do not. No, I do not. And I will also just say that actually, in my opinion, is a good thing, because assuming that she testifies truthfully, we need her testimony. Her testimony and Ken Chesebro's testimony are nails in the coffin, along with Jenna Ellis, for Trump's future freedom. And so I don't think anybody should be kind of arguing right now that Sidney Powell's deal should be tanked based on a couple of things she reposted on Truth Social, because they're not that severe. Okay, somebody asked a question about, apparently, I didn't even know about this until someone asked a question about it on the Patreon feed this morning, but apparently there's a stink being raised about the USDA having slightly modified their anti-discrimination provisions. Okay, so what the USDA has done, just on background, is they have added in, so there are provisions in all USDA funding that says the USDA requires you to not discriminate in schools on the basis of race, religion, gender, lots of other things, okay, in order to receive USDA funding. The USDA, thankfully, has expanded the definition of gender discrimination to include gender identity. This is not a big deal, by the way. I just have to point this out. My kids are at a school that gets USDA funding. Here in California, we have wildly broad protections against discrimination of all sorts, including discrimination on the basis of gender identity in education. I know that's not true in every school district, around the country. Most states, by the way, have anti-discrimination provisions that arguably would extend to things like gender identity in the context of education. And that's one reason why school boards are being targeted so heavily by the hate group Moms for Liberty right now. But I have to point out that this is not a radical move by the USDA, right? Most states already have provisions like this. So this is not anything that is wildly radical by the USDA. It's literally just bringing the USDA anti-discrimination provisions in conformity with modern times. That's all it's doing, okay? What the far right has done with this is they have run with it and now claim that free lunch funding is contingent on the furthering of what's being referred to as Biden's radical transgender agenda, okay? And I just have to say that I think everybody ought to just call this out for the BS that it is, because first of all it's doing is very moderately shifting the anti-discrimination language that the USDA already had in place. And arguably, by the way, I have to point out, there's court authority out there that claims that gender discrimination, just that term, includes gender identity already. All right. So whether or not there would be, if somebody challenged this, there would be any debate about it is unlikely, right? If you had a gender anti-discrimination provision on the basis of gender and you were discriminated against as a trans student, you know, or for that matter, your school did it and you were moving to try to get their USDA funding revoked, you probably stand a fairly good chance of like doing that through the appropriate legal mechanisms. All right. I just want people to realize that this is yet another example of the way the GOP takes something that is inherently really benign and turns it into kind of like a culture war point. You know, like reminder, the whole CRT thing was started by this guy, Chris Rufo, who's now running this foundation. This is bonkers, where he's basically like training people on how to create culture wars out of nothing on the base, like just to try to further a fascist agenda, essentially, and to get people to not vote for Democrats. This is essentially like another prime example of this. All right. Like, the USDA funds free lunches to poor kids. All right. Nobody in this country, by the way, in my opinion, who is getting an education should not get free lunch. All right. And one of the things that's great about living in California is that when we had a budget surplus 3 years ago, in the middle of the pandemic, one of the first things that Gavin Newsom did was he gave every single elementary and middle and high school student in California free lunch. Everybody, regardless of whether or not they're like middle class or upper class or working class or poor, everybody gets free lunch. And, you know, that, by the way, really equalizes things in an educational environment, because it means that you don't have kids who are getting free lunch and kids who are paying for lunch, and that everybody can see it in the school lunch line, right? It creates a much more equitable environment on the basis of class identity. And so one of the things that I want people to be aware of here is that, in essence, what they're trying to do is say that the USDA is somehow denying free lunches on the basis of gender identity. And they're not. Like, that's the other thing that people need to be aware of. These anti-discrimination provisions apply to everything that the USDA does. And the USDA can, you know, withdraw funding in the event of like egregious discrimination violations, right? That, like, this is very standard. I have to point out that like the USDA doesn't just administer free lunch. Like, they administer like all sorts of other things like agriculture, right? And they can deny funding on the basis of discrimination, which, by the way, is the same as every other federal agency. So nobody should be surprised by this. It is not some kind of like, I mean, I know I don't even need to say this to this audience, but the idea that this is somehow like some radical trans ideology being put into place by the USDA is just absolute horse pucky. And, you know, nobody should be under the illusion that this is anything other than the far right, like basically inventing another talking point to try to scare the bejesus out of like homophobes who look like white suburban mothers, right? That's all they're doing. So it's not a big deal. And, you know, honestly, the other thing here is that, you know, if there is an effort undertaken to try to defund the USDA as a result of this, the people who are going to suffer the most from that are going to be poor kids. And, you know, again, that's no surprise. So, all right. I just talk about one other thing here today, because there was a comment this morning on the Patreon feed that I found very upsetting. And I want to acknowledge that there have been a whole series of incidents that have been reported widely on social media over the last week that are overtly anti-Semitic. There are instances now that are being reported in places like Europe, where the Star of David is being spray painted onto the fronts of businesses that are owned by Jewish people rather. And there's been, I think, 1 or 2 instances of that inside the United States. And I understand very seriously from my Jewish friends and my Jewish family members. I myself am not Jewish, but my nieces are Jewish. My brother-in-law is Jewish. I have my other brother-in-law is Jewish. I have a step nephew who is Jewish. So I have like a very dynamic and diverse family, also racially diverse inside my family as well. And I really understand how the intergenerational trauma and the historic trauma is being triggered by these events. All right. And I think there is something profoundly dangerous. I'm just going to say this about the fact that they are being amplified in the way they are on social media in very dramatic ways. Okay. Because, you know, there are a number of very bad actors who are undertaking this kind of really virulent anti-Semitism. And there are some people, I will freely admit this, on the far left who are also engaging in language that we know is anti-Semitic. All right. However, I also want to say this, okay? I think the wild amplification of this is causing an enormous amount of fear and panic, which is what it's designed to do, right? Like, I want to point this out. These actions are designed, when they are intentional, to be terrorism. Okay, that is what they are designed to be. And I'm not going to diminish anybody's response to this. We have children of Holocaust survivors in this audience and in this community, and it is extremely serious, as is Islamophobia. Okay, and I have to point this out. A 6-year-old boy was stabbed to death by his landlord as a result of this. We have another incident where a Muslim doctor was stabbed to death in the garden of her apartment complex in Texas over the weekend. All right. We are seeing violence on the basis of identity accelerating. Okay. And I'm not going to diminish any of that. Okay. However, I have a very important point that I want to make here today that I really want everyone to hear. Okay. And that is this: there is no excuse for losing your humanity in response to this kind of stuff. All right. There will never be an excuse for murdering 500 children a day in Gaza. There will never be an excuse for that. There's no rationale that makes it humane. There's no rationale that doesn't make it a war crime. Okay. So I'm saying this because I feel the need to say something very explicitly for the safety of this community, because this community is profoundly kind in most instances and incredibly diverse. All right. One of the things that I'm really proud of about this audience over the last 7 years is that we are made up of people from every imaginable identity. And we are a place of profound kindness. We are a place that is really welcoming. We are a place where we listen to one another, where we are proactive, where we are anti-racist, where we fight back against discrimination and hate in all of its forms. Like, that's why I'm here. Okay. So this is what I'm going to say, because I got really upset about this. And I deleted a comment as a result. I understand that people are traumatized, and I understand that people are really upset. But if any comment appears on the Patreon feed or here that dehumanizes another group of people by claiming that it's totally fine to bomb them off the face of the earth, for instance, you will be deleted. And I'm not going to say it again. I'm going to delete the comment. And if I see anything remotely like that again, I will block people, because there is no room in this community for that kind of behavior. And I just can't tolerate it. I also have to say that one of the things that I feel really very strongly about is that we have to be very mindful of the fact that the way in which fascism gains a hold is through dehumanization of others. All right. And we have seen the Trump administration, we've seen the far right internationally exploit crisis points to gain power. And one of the ways that they do that is by scaring people into dehumanizing other folks. All right. Like, you paint a Star of David on somebody's building, and the result of that is, I don't care what happens to kids in Gaza. Okay. That is what they are trying to do, because the result of that is the rise of people like Netanyahu into positions of power that never get lost, like Trump into overthrowing American democracy, right? Like the rise of Le Pen in France. All right. All of this is done by maximizing on othering and dehumanization. All right. The reason why Marine Le Pen has been a threat in every French election is because of all of the anti-immigrant discrimination that has taken place in France over the last 10 years. All right. This is all linked. Okay. So what I'm going to ask people to do here is this. Okay. If you find yourself in a moment of being panicked and terrified, okay, because a few lone actors, and I'm not going to minimize it, it's really serious, but a few lone actors have painted Stars of David on buildings. All right. And again, it is a hardcore reminder of the Holocaust. I'm not going to minimize the effect. You know, it is one of the reasons why I take it as seriously as I do. But if you find yourself in response to that, making comments that indicate that you no longer care about whether or not, for instance, because this is the stat this morning, okay, 280,000 people in Gaza have lost their homes, right? The bombing is so severe right now that literally they have wiped out 20% of the housing stock in all of the Gaza Strip, okay? That's not Hamas. That's families with small children, all right? So if you find yourself in a place where your trauma response, which I am not going to minimize, and I agree is legitimate and is based on centuries, okay, of intergenerational trauma. If you find yourself in a place where your reaction to that is to dehumanize other people and particularly children, I'm going to ask you to take a breath and step back from your keyboard. All right. And I'm going to ask you to do that because the lives of everyone in this audience, everyone, matters to me. And I am not going to create a community where it is okay to say things like that without limitation. All right. And I think that at this moment where so many of us, for a variety of reasons, believe me, I get it. I'm going to remind everybody I have a non-binary child. I understand the ways in which people can get triggered under threat. I'm going to remind everyone that everybody loses. Everybody loses when we lack humanity for other people, when we lose the capacity to sit with compassion and empathy for one another. Okay? Because if we do it to others, others will do it to us. And this is literally what it's all about. Okay? We have to stand in community with one another across every identity group, if we intend to defeat fascism. Full stop. No exceptions. Okay? So I'm sorry for being a little ranty about that today, but I got really upset by the comment that I saw on the Patreon feed and I immediately deleted it. And if there's blowback from that, so be it. But I need to just really ask people, even in moments of really, really awful conditions that I know are extremely triggering. Again, I am not diminishing any of it. To please pause if you find yourself having a response that says other people deserve to die because of this, because that's really what it is. And that is how the rifts in community are created so that people like Trump get reelected and people with fascist agendas get put into power. That's how we justify extreme violence and mass murder and war crimes. And I'm not here for that. So I needed to say that today. And I needed to say it publicly because I feel very strongly and passionately about it. And also because I'm seeing a lot of it elsewhere on social media. And I find it really upsetting. I find it upsetting as a human rights lawyer. I find it upsetting as a human being. And again, I really want to encourage people, if any questions about this, any questions at all, go pick up Jason Stanley's book, How Fascism Works. It's short. Okay. And it is a roadmap to all the various features of fascism that exist and how they are playing out currently in modern dynamics. It came out in 2021. It's still relevant to today's events, but it will explain to you all the ways in which dehumanization and othering, of anyone, play a role in fascist strongholds and the rise of fascist strongmen. So yeah, that's that. And I'm also just going to put out a call for everyone to please be kind, because there's so many people right now who are feeling really terrified and scared. And please try to understand that so many people are suffering for very good reason. And the way in which we combat all of that is by loving one another and operating in kindness and having compassion and empathy and trying to stop cycles of violence that do nothing but create more violence and more hate and more terrorism. All right. We have to do our part. Each of us individually has to do our part. So that's what I want to say about that. And I'm just going to plead with the community to think before you post. Okay. Thank you for for giving me a moment to say that. And again, I'm just going to remind everyone that while I have allowed folks to stay today on the assumption that it was a one-off, if I see it again, I'm going to ban people because I just can't allow it. So that's that. All right. Much love to everyone here. I really, again, want to encourage you to take breaks if you need it, to step away from the news cycle. I also have to remind everybody who's ever been through a course through me that there's a lot of practices you can engage in to create safety in your own home. A lot of people have heard me talk during the pandemic about the fact that we had a calm closet in my house where we converted a whole closet to kind of like a meditation room just so my kids would feel safe. I really encourage you to think through, what do you need right now in your own environment to feel safe, and to create that in space that you control, and to visit it often. because it will help you in terms of your own regulation, and it will help all of us to kind of continue carrying forward. And I also just very much want to encourage you when you are out in the world to assume positive intent, to act in positive ways toward one another, to act in kindness to other folks, including strangers, and to really do your best to self-regulate. Because one of the other things I just have to remind you of here is that the battle ahead of us for 2024 is long, and we've got a lot of work to do. And we need to be able to manage the stress of the events that we're all living through right now in ways that do not have us permanently in fight or flight mode. You can consciously manage this. Believe me, I have a diagnosis of complex post-traumatic stress disorder myself. And I have learned so much through trauma therapy about how to manage my own traumatic responses. It's really important right now, if you've not done that work, to educate yourself, because it will apply to the way you operate in the world as much as it applies anywhere else in your life. All right. So that's that. If you have not liked this broadcast, please like it, please share it, please subscribe. I want to thank you all for being here. I want to thank our Patreon subscribers particularly. You can join us over at patreon.com/ResistanceLive if you want to ask questions before every broadcast. And your contributions there, which run from $2 a month subscriptions, that's less than a dime a broadcast, all the way up to $100 a month, come with lots of perks, as well as a wonderfully supportive community of loving and kind people who are out there doing really good work in the world. And I very much just want to thank our Patreon subscribers for your ongoing contributions that help to keep this broadcast afloat and keep this good work going, including for my staff, who are also like equally amazing people, single parents, trans folks who rely on your subscriptions to feed their families, as I do. And I want to just thank the community in general for understanding nuance and holding space, and for your kindness and your compassion and your understanding and your humanity, because that's what is going to get us all through this and on to something better. All right. Much love, everyone. Take breaks if you need it. I'm just going to say it over and over again. Take breaks, take breaks, take breaks. If you are triggered, if you are upset, if you are in a trauma response, turn off your devices, go for a walk in nature, sit down somewhere in your house and pet your animals, meditate, breathe, remind yourself that you are safe in your own body. Don't hesitate to do that. I actually think it's one of the biggest obligations we have as activists and organizers right now, is to do that for ourselves so we can do it for one another. All right. Much love, everyone. I will see you all here tomorrow at the absolute latest, and I hope you have a wonderful Tuesday. All right. Bye.